known as Grace. Now, I'm in London right now, but usually based in Sydney, Australia, where I'm also a primary care physician on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whom I'd like to acknowledge as the traditional owners of that land and for whom culture, knowledge, and community have been integral to well-being for millennia. My clinical practice serves a broad population that includes First Nations communities. So for me, and I suspect for some of those in the audience and our readership, today's session directly relates to both what we publish and with the people we see in practice. Now, it's my privilege now to introduce three eminent Indigenous scholars for this session on Indigenous data sovereignty and why it matters in scholarly publishing. This is a large and complex area, so bearing in mind our audience, we've elected to focus on some key points for journal editors and researchers. Professor Janet Smylie will provide an overview on Indigenous data sovereignty in academic publishing, including some of the terminology and understandings. Janet is Metis family doctor and research scientist, director of the Well Living House Action Research Centre at Unity Health Toronto, Canada Research Chair in Advancing Generative Health Sciences Services for Indigenous Populations in Canada, and professor in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health and Department of Family Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. Next will be Dr. Lydia Jennings, who will present on the care principles for Indigenous data governance. Lydia is assistant professor in environmental studies at Dartmouth College and leads development of guidance for the governance of Indigenous data in scientific publishing. Our final speaker is Professor Catherine Chamberlain, who is inaugural editor-in-chief for First Nations Health and Wellbeing, the Lowitja Journal, and head of the Indigenous Health Equity Unit at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, University of Melbourne. Kath will discuss how Indigenous data sovereignty can be applied in scholarly publishing. And being a global panel, I should add that and thank particularly Lydia and Kath, all our panelists, for being up at a very early morning for those in North America at 5 a.m., I believe it is, and to Kath in Australia, the other end, for whom it is 11 p.m., I believe. So I'd like to ask Janet Smylie, Professor Janet Smylie, to start us off with an introduction and her presentation on an overview of Indigenous data sovereignty.
Good morning, everyone. I'll say Tanzi Atoya, Kakia, Kiten Scatanello, Janet Smylie Nitsi Kassin, Ochinia Red River, Ekwa, Misquachiwa Skahekin. So I just greeted everybody warmly in my Indigenous language, which is Plains Cree. And I told you my name was Janet Smylie. If I was there in person, I would go around and try to shake everybody's hands warmly, or maybe we don't do handshakes quite as much, but I would greet you warmly and in a good way. And then I told you that my family comes from the Red River and also from the Beaver Hills, which is also known as Edmonton now. So I'm a Métis and Cree woman. But I make my home now. I could say Niwikin Takaranto, so I make my home here in Toronto. So I'm a visitor here on the territories of the Haudenosaunee, Huron, Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And I'm going to get us started with a little bit of a higher level view, because I know that my colleagues have some amazing examples around implementation. So I titled my talk Indigenous Data Sovereignty in Academic Publication. Is this a paradox or a possibility? And that's a little picture of my homelands, and that's the Saskatchewan River. So my peoples and my family were travelers. but this is the Saskatchewan River just out of Saskatoon, and it's one of my favorite spots on the planet. What I wanted to do, first of all, is just talk about why is Indigenous data sovereignty important, and speak to the alignment with some key principles in publication ethics. And then just to talk about what is Indigenous data sovereignty and what isn't, and provide a working definition, which I'm happy for my colleagues to iterate or correct, and a couple of examples. And then hopefully provide some basic tools and questions where participants, I'm assuming most of the participants are linked to non-Indigenous academic journals. So how can you tell the difference between something that is Indigenous data sovereignty and something that isn't? Because we now live in a world of jargon. And Indigenous reconciliation and advancing Indigenous rights in non-Indigenous institutions in our global world is really complicated and a lot of work. And what we see over and over again as Indigenous peoples, and it's just natural, people would try to take shortcuts or appropriate language. And we see that happening now. Okay, so, and just because, and I guess at least for those of you in Europe, it's the middle of the day, but you have an assignment always with me. And to me, that's part of being active in reconciliation. So I have a hypothesis that academic editorial processes and publication systems present multiple barriers to advancing and upholding Indigenous data sovereignty. This comes from over 25 years of being a career scientist, and also being the inaugural senior editor at the Canadian Journal of Public Health, where we tried to institute some academic processes, which were more focused on supporting and ensuring there was adequate Indigenous community engagement, which was the topic of last year's session, in work that was about them. So what is one barrier? So by the end of this, and when we get to the discussion, I'm hoping that you can all think of one barrier in your place of work, right? That has to do, all of you are somehow involved in academic publication. And then what's one thing you can do to mitigate the barrier? This is one of my favorite definitions of Indigenous data governance, and I've been using it for many years. And it's by a preeminent First Nations intellectual, Marlene Brant-Castellano. I've known her for over 30 years. I met her when I was a very young researcher and physician, and she was writing our national, our first version of a national statement on Indigenous research ethics. And so we talk about self-determination, and some of you may not have heard about self-determination or data governance within the context like of knowledge work. Often when we talk about self-determination, people think it's about land claims, land back, maybe environmental activism now, and the need to hold up and respect Indigenous rights as they are written in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But what Marlene Brant-Castellano wrote 20 years ago is it's also about worldviews, right? So it's not only just about who controls the data, like in a corporate way, like from a Euro-Western legal lens, but it's also about self-determination and how the knowledge is actually constructed, right? So that's a key premise. That's one of the take-home points I want people to be really reflecting on, because if you really want to get to holding up Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous scholarship, you need to understand that actually commonly we're working on different operating systems, right? And there's some overlap, right? So there's shared principles like that we view careful and systematic gathering of knowledge and knowledge processes as socially valuable. But there's some distinctions too. And actually, if we think about knowledge systems as part of the ecologic diversity, like of the world, right? It would behoove us to actually engage diverse knowledge systems. And there's not just one Indigenous knowledge system. We're complicated and sophisticated. So the Euro The social, cultural, linguistic diversity, for example, of the Americas prior to European colonization was tenfold that of all of Eurasia. Okay, so why do we need to hold up Indigenous data systems? And how does Indigenous data sovereignty align with the principles? Well, what we have around the world is colonizing data systems. So in fact, this is the current state. The things that we'll hear about in terms of what Dr. Jennings and Professor Chamberlain have been working at are glowing gems of examples, right? Like, and change is needed. But in my day job, every day I get up and I have been working for 25 years now, looking at First Nations, Inuit, and Métis health information systems. And overall, the systems are still incredibly colonized. So what does that mean? It means not the people who don't own the data, people who are not Indigenous maintain control through involuntary counting and tracking. And, you know, these are human concerns because we're all now, I wrote this before big data was really emerging, right? But we're all involuntarily counted and tracked now, I guess. But this has been happening to Indigenous people for a long time. And it's been very harmful because through that involuntary counting and tracking, we lost our children, we lost our resources, we were subjugated to a whole bunch of terrible colonial policies and oppressions. Protect this control by monopolizing ownership. This kind of looks like the little premises of like big data firms. I don't know if Elon Musk read this or not. Dictate who and what will be counted. I'm glad I'm getting a little smile. I can only see my panel's colleagues on the panel. Purposely, systematically undercount or discount to advantage assimilation or maintain unequal distribution of health and social resources. Amazing Native American colleagues are calling this data genocide. You'll hear my example because I've been very passionate about counting in my relatives across geography, because as a Métis woman who is a traveler, I don't understand any traditional or natural law, like in my teachings, that says, well, when your relative moves to the city, you cut them off from health and social resources. But in fact, that literally happened during COVID, where First Nations, Inuit, and Métis relatives living in cities were getting second access to the vaccine, and people that were living in rural and remote geographies were getting first access, and then structured to maintain authority over what is a valid counting method. So anyways, I could give 8 hours of a lecture on how data systems are colonized, but I hope to move from the problem state to the solution state. I was hoping I could go quickly because originally yesterday I thought I would be last on the panel. But here's a little kind of picture. And again, pictures are essentializing, and we want to be careful about that because we're challenging that as diverse global Indigenous peoples. But I actually, part of your homework here is to draw a little picture. What is the governance structure like of like Indigenous data where you work, right? So basically the large majority of Indigenous data in Canada is still, there's a barrier, there's a gate, there's a fence between the people whose data it is, the community members. There's external gatekeepers, the federal government, right? Like Statistics Canada. We have data centers, and I know many of you are working to open up that firewall, right? But the problem is, how will we protect the Indigenous people if everybody can access our data, right? So how do we create a new system where Indigenous leaders and the representatives of the people, the chosen representatives of the people whose data it is, will be in charge? And then remember, the other big problem here is not, so it's not only the structures, and these become IT structures of data access. We can't forget that we're actually working in different worldviews, right? In different systems, and there's some overlaps. So nobody here, I think, would want to have these colonizing data principles. I imagine many of you have worked really hard to have data transparency and data sharing. But the problem is when we have these different kinds of worldviews and systems. So I like to show this picture because, again, it's like a oversimplified, essentialized context, but it's from a very famous legal case where for the first time in Euro-Western legal system in Canada, a First Nations community's traditional ecologic knowledge was actually recognized in a court of Canadian law. But you can see the cartoonists couldn't actually even show the sophistication. They have some cartoonish diagrams compared to all these maps and books. But it's called the Delgamuukw decision. And it was the Gitxsan people. So then the fact that they lived on the land for millennia was actually recognized in the court of law, and their oral history of living on that land was recognized. So then the court recognized their land claim based on the oral history. Okay, so moving on to a few definitions. And again, I hope my colleagues will refine or iterate this, but this morning, Google told me like sovereignty. It's interesting because it's called a supreme authority, right? So the elements of sovereignty just generally, right? It's a weighty word. It actually means that a state can govern its own territory and population or data set without external control, right? But as soon as we submit something to an academic journal, how can we do that without submitting to external control? How do you as editors like relinquish your external control? What kind of trust is required? So this working definition of Indigenous data sovereignty, and because we're so diverse, there should be thousands of definitions, and of course it would be ironic, I'm just one Métis woman, mostly compromised by my academic roles, perhaps, from the perspectives of community, but it would be achieved when the Indigenous people whose data it is have autonomous and ultimate authority over what many perceive, including myself, as a sacred social resource. Okay, so
Janet, just to say there are 2 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a couple more slides. So how can this actually look? So here you saw the linear diagram with the fence and the external gatekeepers. It's easy to draw pictures of what we want, right? But here is a different process. So we talked about before we had the fence, like separating community from data processes. And to me, data processes include policy, research, and action. But here you have the community and the community whose data it is in the middle. And then you have a circle of community partners. So those are chosen community representatives, right? And they're protecting that sacred social resource. And within the community, they choose to use that sacred social resource for research, policy, and action as they would like. But then they share it outside of the community, and they might let people come from outside the community in, right? But there's a circle of, and in my work, that's how we operate it. Easy to draw a picture, hard to do it in person, okay? So we're gonna have time for discussions because I'm gonna end in 1.5 minutes. But here's a discussion question. How do the data sets that you're working with include or exclude the people whose data it is? And what are the implications with respect to structured social inequities? Because more often it's the people who are experiencing social exclusion who don't have control over their information, or sometimes they don't even have any information at all, like my relatives living in the city, so they're invisible, right? When you're not counted, then you're actually going to be even further excluded from social resources. So I have some examples. Don't be alarmed because my colleagues have other examples as well. But just to say, for the last 18 years, the one example I like to share, because it's a little bit different, I've been partnering with Indigenous health service providers who care for relatives living in urban and related homelands, as we call them. And we have developed this Our Health Counts project. And you can see here that at the center are these principles. So this is how we actually think it works. So we've written about this methodology. And this is the part where that Delgamuukw diagram comes in. We're actually trying to operate within an Indigenous worldview and paradigm, as well as manage and make sure legally in Euro-Western law, the community controls the data sets. And we do publish, and we have made impact. So we've shown now 5 times that Statistics Canada is undercounting the number of First Nations, constitutionally rights-bearing First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples in cities by a factor of 2 to 4. And there's been some pretty positive outcomes, and we're working with partners across the country now, but it's just one example. One of the things I love the best about it is the partners and data custodians are actually health service providers. And those of you that work in health information will know that when you're working with the actual health service providers, the data has legs, and it's integrated into providing better Indigenous health services. So back to next steps. What can you do? So the first thing for many of you, because I imagine that the large majority of people on the call are not spending their day job trying to build systems of Indigenous data sovereignty or trying to move forward the big set of ships, the big set of colonial ships that represent the large majority of academic publication processes. So the first thing is try to continue to bravely advance your understanding of historic and ongoing process of colonization within and beyond academic publishing. And I'm happy to share these slides after or come back to them. But then you, in order to not engage in the doublespeak and say, oh, I took a course, I went to the seminar, so now like the Lancet or BMJ or Canadian Medical Association journal is doing Indigenous data sovereignty, because you won't be able to do it just after this panel. Maybe you will after you hear from Dr. Jennings and Professor Chamberlain, but certainly not from me. So why don't you try drawing an organogram to start with? Dr. Chu and I had an amazing discussion yesterday, and I was saying, okay, well, you know, and when I was working at the Canadian Journal of Public Health, we transitioned to Elsevier, right? So these are large, like global corporations that publish our journals. Of course, we have editorial boards, and many of you have worked really hard to review and think about the impacts as maybe journals have transitioned to larger publication agencies. So what is the organogram and the governance diagram for where you work? What is the epistemic orientation and assumptions? And can you describe and list it? And how do those things impact the advancement of Indigenous data sovereignty? And then what can you do to mitigate the impacts? So hopefully in 17 minutes, I've shared a little bit about why it's important, Indigenous data sovereignty, what it might be, what it isn't, and how can you identify the distinctions? So those two things, drawing a little organogram, and then thinking about the ways of knowing our epistemology. And you have an assignment. What is one barrier in my place of work, and what is one thing I can do to mitigate this barrier? I know that there's at least one moderator who has an answer to that question, but I hope as an act of Indigenous reconciliation, some of the audience members will share as well. So that's me. Thanks so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your overview and the helpful tips on how we can take first steps, as well as outlining what the benefits are to the communities we serve by heeding these principles. Indigenous data sovereignty doesn't apply only to health research, of course. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Lydia Jennings, who is an environmental soil scientist at Dartmouth College, to discuss the care principles which are intended for all disciplines.
Hello, thank you so much. And Dr. Smylie, a great presentation that really sets the foundation and kind of groundwork of a lot of this bigger discussion. And so I'm very appreciative to be here and share a bit about our work. I'm really applying the care principles, which I'll discuss in a moment, but kind of broadly Indigenous data governance into the scholarly publishing landscape. I really want to highlight that this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, it extends beyond conversations of diversity, equity, inclusion to really affirm Indigenous rights to data in all disciplines. And I think more broadly, you know, there's a question that I saw in the chat that I just want to really quickly address. Indigenous data and any kind of way that we form data is inherently influenced, it is subjective, inherently influenced by the communities that we come from, the way that we position and organize data, how we communicate it out, the technologies that we develop, right? So all of us are inherently subjective in how we create data. And Indigenous peoples have long been data creators, data stewards, and data and developing data stewarding systems. And so I just wanted to really highlight that. If you can go to the next slide, please. I've already been mentioning the CARE principles, so kind of to bring them forward, they are a really valuable framework to think about Indigenous data and how we govern that data. And it really affirms 4 principles that go in conjunction or are complementary rather with the FAIR principles. So thinking one about collective benefit and how are we designing data ecosystems that function in ways that enable Indigenous people to derive benefit from the data. They're thinking about the authority to control. So what are Indigenous people's rights and interest in Indigenous data, and how is it recognized over such data, specifically in data ecosystems? And so publishing is one of those. What is our responsibility as data creators, as data stewards, as data repositories, that we have a responsibility with the data and how it's used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and individual and collective benefits. And then also, what are their ethical practices and well-being? How are those concerns at all stages of the data life cycle and across data ecosystems? And so I really highlight these 4 considerations that are complementary to the FAIR principles. These were designed for Indigenous people specifically, but it's been widely recognized that they help benefit many other communities as well. Next slide, please. So this issue of the CARE principles and why should you, as publishers, as data stewards, care about the CARE principles? It's important to recognize that all of us in the science ecosystem, whether it's in health and environmental sciences, whether it's researchers or data repositories or funders or institutions, we should all work to ensure that relevant scientific evidence is processed and used ethically and preserved, documented, and fairly credited so that communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can make data-informed decisions. And increasingly, we see representation of Indigenous knowledge in Western science practices, particularly with open science, having more access to complex and large data sets for discovery and decision-making. As well, and really thinking about within that, what are the Indigenous people's governance rights to this data in open sharing platforms? And also, how can scientific and scholarly communities, and when I work in particular with the American Geophysical Union, represent these communities of care and community responsibility to really kind of change our practices moving forward? And I think this is important, especially important for myself as an ecological scientist, where everyone is collecting on Indigenous lands and ecosystems and waters, and communities need relations back to that data. And non-Indigenous scientists have a responsibility to help support those relationships back to the data. And this is just one image of a recent paper that came out looking at how more than ever people are looking and creating data and asking Indigenous communities to help create data related to their ecosystems. And so we need to make sure that we have a safe environment for data to enter these ecosystems. Next slide, please. So this is just from a paper that came out earlier this year, really thinking about as we foster data ecosystems, we all have a role in this. We all are responsible. We think about the areas of how we're creating data and really influencing systemic changes on an intergenerational responsibility level. And so we see the quickest changes really happening on these individual or research teams or even professional societies. And those that take a bit longer to shift changes tend to be in funding agencies, governmental agencies, and international bodies. But us in the publishing realms, we are really kind of in the center of this, of kind of the more quicker changes to the more complex changes. And so I think there's a lot of possibilities of how we foster that change moving forward. Next slide, please. So an important piece of this project that I'm talking about here today was really to kind of bring together scientists, data repositories, publishers, metadata experts, really recognizing how the CARE principles of Indigenous data governance are being applied and operationalized at various stages of life cycle of the data ecosystems. But there's been inconsistent practices across this life cycle and by data actors. So we convened scholars, publishers, editors, and metadata experts to really develop and co-create publishing guidelines to better operationalize the Indigenous data sovereignty and the care principles across the data and research life cycle. And it's one that, again, that was really created in collaboration with Indigenous communities and that can be adopted and implemented well. And so this effort really convened you're going to see over 120 scholars and metadata experts. Next slide, please. Oops, I'm sorry, actually stay here. I think it's really important to note we held 4 different workshops, each one bringing in at least half more of the participants. So we started with 30, the next session was 60, then we went up to 120. So each time we're bringing more and more community members to really help co-develop these principles. And I think it's really important to know this is the first of its kind. Next slide, please. So this is our leadership team, again, really highlighting that and underscoring that this is Indigenous led, really catalyzed by my mentor, Dr. Stephanie Carroll. And then I kind of took on as a leadership role, and then important mentorship from Dr. Jane Anderson and Dr. Maui Hudson. Next slide. Also important to highlight that we had so much incredible support from the American Geophysical Union staff, as well as from NISO team to really help catalyze this moving forward. Next slide. And so moving forward, we've now created a set of guidelines for the governance of Indigenous data and scientific publishing. Again, a community-led effort with over 120 participants consisting of scholars, publishers, editors. We will be releasing this coming up at the American Geophysical Union in December. So next slide. I just wanted to show a few of the kind of the previews of the guidelines, of what this might look like. Next slide. So we really want first and foremost to look at what are the stages of the scholarly publishing workflow, and what is it, again, asking throughout this process, what does it look like to operationalize the care principles in journals? And so one of the important pieces was we first looked at lots of work of how we connect and correct power imbalances and inequities that have long existed in the scholarly publishing processes. And so that especially includes access and control of data published in journal articles. And so as we think about how do we operationalize the care principles, we deeply assess the scholarly publishing workflow and how we can move beyond a statement or a checkbox that I think sometimes publishers are looking for, and instead to make it much more intentional and iterative. And particularly, how do we have educational resources embedded within this? I think what I really want to highlight in this stage of the workflow is that this is layered and complicated, but also that there's a lot of opportunities to create change and to come together as a community. So next slide, please. So this is just a couple of examples of how in each of this lifetime or stage of the scholarly publishing workflow, we're adding pieces that can really help enhance this. And so next slide, when we look at just the pre-submission pieces, we often hear feedback that by the time research comes in, it's too late. So instead, recognizing how journals are downstream in the process of publishing, these guidelines can influence the direction of funder and institutional policies, where many researchers design studies to fit publishing requirements. So we instead thought about what are the types of resources and trainings that already exist that we can have put in the forefront of this so that publishers and scientists and scholars can really have those help inform their project designs. Next slide, please. So then we think about even the submission process. What are the ways that we can help enhance that? And so one is that journals have requirements on how we can have care compliance, thinking about how we can better describe engagement in the submission process itself, thinking about how they are having policies around data sharing processes that embed the care principles, or how to expand authorship that include multi-personal entities, group authorship, positionality statements, all these that are demonstrating how researchers are engaging with Indigenous peoples. This is something that I think Dr. Smylie really has spoken to, and I know our next presenter is also going to speak to. Next slide. Then we also think about the publication policies that journals and publishers can have. So again, thinking about comprehensive and ethical policies that include, I or B is the baseline. So how do we have and continue to evolve ethical expectations in this process? How do we think about multiple routes to open sharing? And one thing I was really put forth was pre-printing, sharing the author accepted manuscripts. Again, making sure that information is available, and also that it has community approvals. Yeah, and then I think also creating spaces for Indigenous perspectives within journal content and community articles. So thinking about how do we create new article types, multimedia preprints, webinars that really ensure Indigenous leadership is involved in some of these publishing processes. Next slide. We also thought about what are the staff and editor assessments. A really common issue that many of us Indigenous scholars face is that we often will get asked to be, I know as early career professors, I think I get a request to edit an article every week, and I just can't keep up with that, right? So instead, how do we think about how we both train editors, think about staffing capacities, and really continue to create capacity and compensate editors, particularly if people are asking community members specifically. So these are just a few of the pieces that put forward. Next slide. I know I don't want to spend too long on all of these, but there's just so many great resources. Thinking about the production and publishing processes, how can we have tools like traditional knowledge labels and from local contexts and biocultural labels on articles, or article badges showcasing how they've have considerations for the care principles, or thinking about badges and metrics through the ORCID IDs of how you're connected to communities. Oh gosh, I'm running out of time. Okay, so I'm just gonna pop ahead. Again, there are many, many different types of tools. What I wanna highlight, if you go to the next slide, please, is that we have over 25 pages of 60+ recommendations. It's a lot, we know. So our last convening, we really brought together publishers and scholars, Indigenous scholars, and asked what's the highest priority, what's the lowest priority. And so that's what we're kind of putting forth now as we move forward. Next slide. I think really important is that we also have discussions on what are the most difficult pieces. And what are ways that we make this beyond just ticking the boxes, but actually more comprehensive. And so that's something I'm really excited about. Well, again, coming out to this next slide. But what's really important is that even in just being involved in this process, we have journals like Taylor and Francis who are already starting to implement these suggestions. Next slide. And then also next slide. So this is Taylor and Francis when we often present this work with them, and so how they're already implementing some of these suggestions. They're already putting, next slide. They're already putting forward the care principles into their pre-submission processes. Next slide. They're already beginning to implementing group authorship happening. So you see this collective happening. Next slide, please. They're also beginning to have other representation authorship. So you see here it's a tribal elder to really protect the author's identity of a community nation itself. Next slide. And they're already beginning to do publishing in dual languages. The first time this ever happened, right? Where you're having in both English and a Maori abstract. So really exciting pieces. Next slide. And then we're going to one more slide forward, just so I can get to the end of these pieces. What's important is that also Taylor and Francis is internally prioritizing what is high priority for us now, what are the things that we want to do down the line. So again, all of these recommendations are going to be what are the most important out of these 60+ recommendations that specific journals can do now, what can they do later on. Next slide. And as we think about implementation, I think what's really exciting is that at our release in December, we're going to have more journals sign on and endorse these publication guidelines and really continue to expand these. So next slide. I think importantly is that these guidelines offer a variety of ways to engage with the care principles. So again, some journals are already implementing these. And again, thinking about how do we communicate reference to care principles. We know authors are already engaged in this, but journals are thinking about how can we better support them. And again, we're really utilizing these tool sets to move towards more meaningfully endorsing these guidelines themselves as they become released. Next slide. So if you want to learn more about them, and if maybe you can't make it to American Geophysical Union, please go ahead and use our QR code. We'd love to discuss this more with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lydia. It's been a comprehensive description of care principles and how journals can take these forward. These practical examples are so useful. We move now to our final speaker, who is Professor Catherine Chamberlain. As I mentioned, Kath is the inaugural editor-in-chief for First Nations Health and Wellbeing, the Lowitja Journal, as well as being head of the Indigenous Health Equity Unit at the University of Melbourne. And just before Kath speaks, I should like to remind people, please do pop your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them after the speakers have finished their presentations. And please, other members of the audience, feel free to upvote these questions as they come along. Over to you, Kath.
Great. Thanks, Mabel, and thanks so much, Janet and Lydia, for the really fantastic presentations before this. I think that's really, provide a lot of really helpful information. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about local perspectives in Australia, about how we've been trying to apply Indigenous data sovereignty principles and governance with the Lowitja First Nations Health and Wellbeing Journal. So just to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, which is right down here, or down in Victoria, down the south of Australia. For those of you overseas, you might not know how many different nations we have across Australia. It's incredibly diverse. Many of these countries that you can see here all have different languages, cultures, there's a lot of diversity amongst our communities. And I'm originally from a Trawlway woman from Tasmania, so down on the northeast coast, but just living across this bridge, which was about 10,000 years ago, was actually connected by land, so separated off. So just a little bit of an introduction to some of the people in our group. So I co-editor-in-chief with Professor Moana in New Zealand, and we've got some really amazing senior editors and also a really extensive team of associate editors. All the editors on the team are First Nations people from around the world, a lot from Australia, but also Canada, New Zealand, and America. And we really want to expand that to other countries as well. So today I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the Indigenous data sovereignty care principles and how we're applying this within the Lowitja Journal, and just think about some particular perspectives in Australia, because we've been having some workshops over here as well, and I think coming out with a lot of similar stuff to what's been happening in through other consensus processes, and it's really good to see how it's coming together. So just first to briefly outline the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. We don't have time to go into too much detail in the short time today, but there's a lot of really strong reasons, which I think Janet alluded to, about why people feel so strongly about Indigenous data sovereignty in our communities, because we've had a long time through colonisation of information and data being published about us, and largely published by non-Indigenous researchers and in ways that just doesn't reflect our worldviews. And a lot of this has been really damaging and demeaning and undermining our sense of dignity and as sovereign peoples, as outlined in the United Nations Declaration, which, as Lydia pointed out, is the rights to self-determination, really undermines all of this. And I was reflecting on that. We've just had the visit. We've got Adam Rutherford over here at the moment. I'm not sure for all of you people calling from the UK and Europe. I think he talks quite a lot over there, and it's been quite enlightening talking about the role of eugenics in science. I hadn't realised how much there was actually until Friday, when I went to a kind of lecture with him, really outlining a lot of that and how harmful it's been. So the other thing to I think that's just important to really flag is that the whole way of valuing knowledge within our communities, in Indigenous communities, is really quite different from Western ways of valuing knowledge. It's really a lot of we have a lot of shared values in the way that knowledge is acquired and used, and the way that it's shared, and this can be a real source of tension. We've got quite a lot of cultural protocols in communities about who actually owns the knowledge, and even within that ownership, we do have specific rules and protocols about how people who own that knowledge can use it and for what purpose. So very similar to the Western copyright laws and all of that kind of thing, but we have had these rules and laws and ways of practicing and managing knowledge that have gone on for tens of thousands of years, in Australia at least. And so it's a real source of tension when those rules and protocols are breached. So we want to try and bring those back in to thinking about how we manage our own data. As Lydia said, we've got these care and fair principles that are outlined here. Developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and I think it's really exciting to see these guidelines coming out to go into more detail about how we can be practicing these, and there's some tools going on about how to develop them. Some of the ways that we've been trying to implement some of these principles within the Lowitja Journal are that we have our journal is owned by the Lowitja Institute, so whereas the Lowitja Institute is Australia's first community-controlled institute, they have a board that reports to the community, and our accountability is to the community. And this journal is owned by the Lowitja Institute in partnership with Elsevier. So our aim of it is to expand access to First Nations research and increasing First Nations scientific and community collaboration, and really trying to build up that knowledge of First Nations worldviews and our ways of thinking and doing things. As I said, all of our editorial team are First Nations people. We do have non-First Nations reviewers, but we make sure that the editorial process is managed by First Nations people. We have a policy that all papers must include substantive contributions from First Nations authors. So we don't want the tick box thing. People have to demonstrate that the first, second, or the senior author is Indigenous, and we really do try to look carefully at the papers and say, well, is this authentically being developed and written by Indigenous people and had authentic input and guidance from Indigenous people, so that those worldviews and ways of doing things are upheld within the paper. We invite papers from all over the world. We ask authors if they'd like to include a biography to establish positionality, which is part of our customs. We also offer people the opportunity to include the cultural identity as parenthesis after their author name on the publications. We have specific guidance around citing oral knowledge, because traditionally our knowledge has been passed on through stories and song and other ways. And what we don't want is for people who have that knowledge that might have been passed on for tens of thousands of years then to be taken up, written down by a researcher, whether that researcher is Indigenous or non-Indigenous, and then for that to be cited as the seminal source of that knowledge. We really want the authentic, original source, seminal source of the knowledge to be cited correctly, and that includes of oral knowledge that's passed on. We also ask authors to report against the consider statement for health research for all research articles, and I'll just go through that in a bit more detail here. So this is the consider statement. It is just focused on health research, so it's not as broad as what you were talking about, Lydia, but it's got separate sections on governance, prioritisation, relationships, methodologies, participation, capacity, analysis and interpretation, and dissemination. And we don't expect, all the authors and all the papers to have always done everything for this. So, for systematic reviews and things like that, a lot of these criteria might not be relevant. But we do ask at least to have the transparency about what's been done. So we ask, like you would with the PRISMA guidelines and others, to indicate on the form whereabouts in the article this particular issue's been addressed. And we have checklists to ensure respectful research. And yeah, I'll just go into a little bit more detail there. So we've got the main. This is a bit of a summary of the care principles, but with governance, we look at whether there's partnership agreements, partnership accountability, review mechanisms, and protection of Indigenous intellectual property. And I've just lined up where they, roughly lined up there the care and fair principles that these statement items relate to. We asked people to explain how the research aims emerged. Was this a priority identified by Indigenous people or elsewhere? We asked people to reflect on the relationships and whether there's measures to adhere to Indigenous ethical guidelines, approval processes, involvement of Indigenous stakeholders and expertise of the research team. With the methods, we asked people to talk about their approach and the implications for Indigenous stakeholders and how socio-ecological considerations and worldviews might be incorporated into the methods. We ask about participation, or ask people to talk about how they got their consent sought, the resource demands on communities, how that was addressed, any biological and other samples and data storage issues, including the process of removing samples and other things from traditional lands and how these are disposed of. We asked people to talk about the capacity building of Indigenous researchers, how that's been supported within the research process, including within communities. We ask around analysis and interpretation, how the research reporting supported critical inquiry and strength-based approaches. And also with dissemination, we ask around, with how this is being shared with Indigenous governing bodies and the process of knowledge translation and implementation. So I just wanted to now just share a little bit about some of the particular things in Australia. So at the Lowitja Institute, there is a discussion paper on Indigenous data sovereignty that's been put out, and that has been established by the Mayamnari Wangara Collective, Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective, which was founded in 2018. And it was, it's a community-led process that was developing up these principles. And essentially they've outlined that data sovereignty is achieved when research is Aboriginal-led, includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and is data collected and reflects values and frameworks, requires all researchers to actively engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities, respects the rights to be involved in all aspects of research. The principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance are upheld, and really strong governance to ensure the data collection. So this was, the local perspective about what's really critical to be upheld here. There's quite a lot of work going on in Australia with the government. We have the Closing the Gap agreement, and access to shared data is one of the real priorities of that. There's been a few things that have been worked out for how sharing data with government works in practice, but there's still some aspects that are going to take a little bit more to be working through. We do realise there's discussions around disaggregation that seem to be a bit different here in Australia. So we really have a lot of strong arguments that we need Indigenous specific data for all of our data to be able to inform programs and policies for our communities. And we were reflecting with Mabel about this before, that we realise there's some concerns in Europe about risks of disaggregation, and certainly we do recognise those risks here, and that's why we think that the principles of Indigenous data governance, having Aboriginal people involved in how that data's analysed and disseminated is really critical to protect against those risks. There are quite a few challenges that I think we're still going to need to work out, and I think there's quite a few tricky things. Where there's research ethics around the data, so particularly a disaggregation of the existing data sets where the initial data collection was done across the population, potentially without any regard for community and cultural protocols. What do we do with that data and how do we govern that? There's challenges talking about giving permission for Indigenous knowledges within the communities, because do we give consent for our ancestors and future generations, and is it individual consent or collective consent? There's a bit of debate about those kind of things. We're definitely not going to be able to sort those out tonight. And there's also challenges with open science and scholarship roles, so we need to be careful that we're not applying generic principles which conform with the Western rules and don't recognise Indigenous rules around collective obligations and risks of collective harms. So that whole debate about whether consent should be individual or collective is a bit fraught, and we need to be working through that. I think that's all I was going to say about that. So yeah, thanks for listening and thanks for being here for this. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Kath, for sharing with us your experience of how to operationalize these principles for your own journal. I think there'll be lots of people in the audience thinking, well, where to start? And my sense from what you're saying is that you start where you can, recognizing that there are challenges that even an Indigenous-led journal might have. But I think we've heard tips from each author, each panelist rather, on what we could each be doing. There are some questions. I was going to share a very quick example of how Indigenous authors helped us at the Lancet Group to understand more about Indigenous data sovereignty and what journals can do behind the scenes. We could do that, or we could, I think, throw to the audience, which I think may be more useful. The first question is, what can journals do to signal engagement with and support decolonisation? What can journals do to signal engagement with and support of decolonisation if we can't enforce a specific policy? Would anyone like to take that question? Just unmute yourself or raise a hand.
Hi there.
Yes. Oh, Lydia. Was that Lydia or Janet?
This is Janet. Is that
Hi.
okay? But I guess I actually think it's important to act, because if you signal but you don't have an action, then it's tokenizing, right? So, and I guess changing a policy is one kind of action, but you've just heard like there's a multitude of policies. So for example, Dr. Chu has an example that she shared with me yesterday, just even actions around supporting collective authorship. You heard those from Dr. Jennings. People are implementing it. Those are policies, right? Implementing a policy where you'll try to ensure like peer reviewers of an article come from the Indigenous group or related group who the article is about. So I actually do think there's big and small policies. So I think that it is important to actually do something concrete and tangible. I think that we all care about impact, right? Impact is tangible change. So why would we want anything different in this domain? If I could, there was another interesting question actually about epistemology, right? Like somebody was confused about what is real and what isn't real. And I just wanted to say that was another question. And I don't know if we should read the question or not.
Yes, I'll do that. This audience member says, I'm a bit confused about defining what's real. Isn't one of the goals of science to establish what is real objectively, as in things fall down because of gravitational force, for instance? Could you expand on this?
Yeah, so in fact, that is exactly the second step. So there was two things I wanted people to do. One was to think about how your journal is actually governed, right? Because the journal that Professor Chamberlain was talking about, the Journal of Indigenous Health and Wellbeing, is an Indigenous community controlled journal, right? And then the second thing was to think about what is your knowledge system and your knowledge assumptions. But in fact, like if a rock falling is real, particle physicists might actually say, though, that the rock isn't solid, right? And that it's actually comprised like of unpredictable states, like of matter, right? And positivism, right? That if we observe it, it's real. That's a really good kind of science. And it's the premise of most of the like health science method and physical science methods, right? But once we start moving into complex social systems, it might not be as good, right? We can't control everything. We can't see everything, illness and health experience, right? Or the way that societies respond to climate change and experience climate change are not necessarily fully observable. We have to ask people about it. So that's exactly your frame. You're saying, this is my knowledge frame and I'm confused. So what I'm saying is, that's great. You've started describing your knowledge frame. Now realize that there's a whole bunch of other knowledge frames and think about that. That's my answer to the question. And now I'll look forward to my colleagues responding or answering the rest of the questions.
Thanks, Janet. I completely agree about understanding the worldview that you're in yourself. I think when the thing about decolonisation, when you're part of the main dominant colonizing culture, that feels as though that's the norm, and it's hard to imagine that anything else is the norm. And so part of unpacking it, I think the questions there, how can journals signal engagement with and support decolonisation? I think having, incorporating views that are not part of the dominant norm, making sure that you're getting those different worldviews so that you're getting those different perspectives, and really, pushing people and to challenge themselves to think about the ways that people, the ways that people think about things. As you've said, Janet, I don't know if that makes sense, but you get, yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think Janet did a great example of kind of giving this very physics applied piece to that, right? And I smile because this is a question I feel like as an Indigenous environmental scientist I get all the time of like, well, that might be traditional ecological knowledge, but like I actually do more hard sciences. And it kind of shows this sometimes scientific or epistemological superiority when I think many of us are here because we want to figure out how to better support a variety of knowledge systems and pluralisms. And there isn't a true veracity of knowledge, as Dr. Smylie mentioned. That's kind of a positivism that's been heavily disproven since the 1950s, I believe, and a long body of scholarship that support that. So in thinking about how we build connections and relationships, which is such a core part of Indigenous scholarship, it is being mindful. And this is why we have something like positionality statements of the positionality that we bring into the work. And it's important that we have that for a variety of audiences to see, like, I am a Yaqui scholar. So if I write about things that are happening in New Zealand, I have to be really contextualized of how I was invited to do that work in partnership and informed by the frameworks and the scholarship of communities there, if I'm invited to do so. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't invite myself to do that work, right? And I think those are really important ways that we think about how we decolonize our research practices and also our publishing practices. But I think like always continuing to ask and frame and be reflective in the work itself, I think is a really core component of Indigenous scholarship that we are here to kind of continuously share with broader communities.
There's another one here. This audience member says, good day, researchers. I'm an emerging researcher that's interested in publishing articles. What's the best way to start and apply these principles shared? Lydia, shall we start with you?
Yeah, I guess the biggest piece is like, where do you want to publish and what are the guidelines that they have there? And if they don't have anything about the care principles about engaging with Indigenous authors, I mean, I think often those guidelines are the baseline. So like I, for example, do research in ecological samples. We don't have an IRB for environmental samples, but like as an Indigenous researcher, I am thinking about how the soils and plants have our more than human relationships. So what are like the what can I do with the communities that I'm working with to think about the responsibility I have to returning those data relations, not just data relations, but also physical samples. What does that look like? Is that something the community's thought about? So that's how I often think with my scholarship. Again, journal publications or institutional regulations will be kind of the baseline. But also I think a great thing with baseline is that you can go above and beyond. So that's how I would maybe start to think about with this. And again, these guidelines will be published very soon. We're working on both releasing them, but also having a companion article to come out with them. So if you're interested in thinking about how you can institutionalize some of these frameworks and suggestions that we've made, please follow the QR code and I can share that again if you're interested. We would love to engage with you more.
Thanks, Lydia. Janet or Kath, do you have anything further to add on this?
Just to jump in from health and social sciences and is just to engage and see if you can have a relationship or build your relationships with the Indigenous peoples that you are researching or working with on research, even if it's your own peoples, right? There's social accountabilities. I quoted Marlene Castellano, like on data governance, but one of the other important early learning she shared with me is that she actually drew kind of a picture of a whole bunch of data dots. And she said, health sciences is commonly interested in sorting out these outcomes, these individual points, right? But actually an Indigenous approach would be understanding that the relationship between the points is just as important as the points themselves, right? And those points like are describing human beings. So it all starts with my first step would be, if I want to publish, have 100 or 1,000 cups of tea with the people that you're engaging with. And if you're an Indigenous scholar, that includes if you're engaging with your own people.
I'd like to throw now to another question from the audience, which I think is very pertinent just in the last few minutes. Doesn't the notion of decolonization of scientific publications run counter to the whole notion of open science, which should be as objective, as impartial as possible? Big question in the last 4 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this again goes that Indigenous peoples and the care principles are the fair and the care, which I think is often the notion of open science, and making sure things are findable, interoperable, accessible, right? All those pieces, like Indigenous people want that too, right? But right now we have so much information out there about us, and you even think about the information that was collected during colonial expeditions that we still don't have our relationships to. I work a lot in biodiversity data. We've been collecting biodiversity since the 1500s. And currently in the largest global biodiversity information facility, we have 0 ways of finding that data. So I think, yes, we want data to be available, but also we need to be, when it has an impacts on the real life Indigenous people's lives, we also want to be able to have governance of how that's used. And what stories are being put forward about Indigenous communities at large. I'm going to pass over to Dr. Smylie.
And then maybe we can give the final word to Kath. But I guess really, do we believe in impartiality? Right? So even if you're describing anything, you're choosing what part of it you're going to describe. Are you going to describe the data outputs or the relationship between the data? Right? There's gravitational fields are forces that connect things, right? So I guess I'm not sure that open science, I believe that this definition of what open science is and objectivity and impartiality are fixed in a certain worldview, which is a good worldview, right? But this worldview is not stopping climate change, right? This worldview wasn't used by people to live for millennia, like on territories without ruining the environment, right? Like, so it's fine if you want to be stuck in that worldview, that's okay. But I actually don't believe any journal editor, anybody here, I do not believe that journals are impartial. And I would love, I could share a lot of reasons why. It's a philosophical question, and you're ethicists, right? So I would hope that some of you are being reflective and self-locating around your epistemic self-location. But it's fine if you don't want to, but then I wouldn't recommend that you try to hold up Indigenous data sovereignty, because basically the premise then is you know better and your worldview is better.
Thanks, Dalla.
Yeah.
I think that is a really interesting question. I mean, I don't see any conflict between decolonisation and objective worldviews. Just don't see the conflict there. I think, we're all on the same journey, the search for truth in research, which I guess, is objectivity or authentic subjectivity. They're both truths. And I think, what we're trying to do with the Indigenous data sovereignty principles is really bring that authentic truth of Indigenous knowledge through an Indigenous lens, into the science. We've had it for so long. It's been the stories of Indigenous people have been told through the skewed lens of non-Indigenous researchers that don't have that, the lived experience and reality, and it's not told through that truth. So I think, I think this is about getting at the core of the truth through these principles.
Yeah, and maybe the difference between empirical observation and impartiality, right? Like, so I would agree with the concepts of trying to be precise about empirical observations, but part of that includes describing precisely the location from which you're making that observation. So even in physics, like, what is the location now? Because we know, with relativity, that matters.
Thank you so much to all our panelists for sharing with us your wisdom and your insights. It's given us lots of food for thought. It's been challenging at times, but I think that's what science is all about. It's about examining what we understand and challenging ourselves. Science, the research enterprise, I think, is also very much a relational one. It's been great to have this conversation. I hope everyone in the audience has these conversations with others. Have a think about the questions that Jan put to us about possible barriers in your workplace and what you can do to mitigate those barriers. I must say, at the Lancet group, and I didn't share this example, we had an example of a paper where the authors presented us with an analysis. This was a piece of Indigenous-led work, presented us with a piece of work that had unusual analysis, which the peer reviewers initially criticized and asked them to reanalyze. But when the author's rebuttal explained their health equity framework, we had a rethink, the reviewers had a rethink, and decided to go ahead and decided to agree with the author's original approach. That whole process helped us to, led to us really rethinking how we do things, what our standards ought to be. It's led to us developing and launching guidelines on race and ethnicity, which includes encouraging authors to use the Consider tool that Kath has already mentioned. And I think ultimately, and I should mention too, the Consider tool is also endorsed by the Equator Network of Health Research Reporting Guidelines. So I guess to us, our experience has been that engaging with Indigenous communities like this have really strengthened and deepened our knowledge systems. So hoping very much to have more of these conversations. Thank you everyone for staying the extra couple of minutes. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but please feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to follow things up. Thanks very much, everyone.